experts who bring different approaches to this question on a shared platform. And today's edition is focusing on international climate finance. We are grateful that we could secure the participation of 3 outstanding experts in that area. They are Dr. Tara Shivani, Andrea Pampa, and Dr. Alex Vaza. A warm welcome to all of you. I will introduce each of you in more detail later, but will first provide some logistical details and a brief introduction into the topic. So this webinar is organized in 2 parts. In the first part, each panelist will get around 10 minutes to present their perspective on the topic based on their experience and background. And after that, we'll have time for a discussion between the panelists and you, the audience. As this is a webinar, the participants are muted and without video. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function, where you can also upvote or comment on others' questions. Please be advised that this event is going to be recorded and that a recording will be published on our website. So before I hand over to our first speaker, Tara, I would like to provide a brief introduction into the topic, which is international climate finance. I'd like to kick off this webinar with a powerful fact that underscores the importance of our discussion today. So despite only 17% of the world's population living in the industrialized economies of the global north, they've managed to produce a whopping 60% of the planet warming greenhouse gases in the past 170 years. Now, for some perspective, if we exclude China, all the developing economies combined have only contributed about 20% to these historical emissions, even though they make up a significant 65% of the world population. Dealing with this imbalance has been a major point of discussion at COP talks for years now. And back at COP 15, which was in 2009, 23 developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020. The idea was to use this funding for climate action in developing countries, helping them adapt to a changing climate. This is the adaptation part, and reduce emissions in their own economies, which is the mitigation part. The Paris Agreement in 2015 reinforced this commitment, and those involved decided that this sum should be distributed each year between 2020 and 2025. With the goal of achieving a balance between mitigation and adaptation. Just to help you understand how much $100 billion is, it's roughly as much as developing, assembling, and running the International Space Station ISS for 10 years. However, we know that not all effects of climate change can be dealt with through mitigation and adaptation, and that's why in recent years there's been a growing recognition for a separate financial mechanism to address unavoidable loss and damage. That's why during COP28 a couple of weeks ago, the participating parties, they reached an agreement on a framework to create a fund specifically for financing loss and damage. However, crucial details about this fund, like the size or how it's going to be governed, still remain unclear. Also, it's important to know that monitoring the flows of climate financing is very challenging because there's no agreed upon definition of what qualifies as climate finance, and there's also a lack of consistent accounting rules. The OECD has been tracking the progress towards the pledge since 2015. And it produces regular analysis of the progress made. And to get everyone on the same page, I would like to provide a short overview on the main findings of this report of late 2023 on the aggregate trends of international climate finance. And I believe you can already see the slide on that. I want to share with you 4 findings. The first finding is that the total contributions have not although they've increased in recent years, they have not yet reached the 100 billion. According to this last report, in 2021, it was around 90 billion US dollars. On the basis of preliminary and unverified data, the OECD said last year that the goal looks likely to have been met in 2022. The second finding is that if we look, if you can go back to the first slide, please. If we look at the sources of the funding, public climate finance continues to account for the vast majority of the total. And within that public climate finance, multilateral finance has grown the most since 2013. And mobilized private climate finance has not experienced a rise in recent years. Then if you can go to the next slide, the third finding is that, so here we can see the areas into which the finance was going. We can see that in 2021, mitigation finance accounted for 60% of the climate finance, while adaptation accounted for only 27%. Then the next slide, please. It shows the financial instruments used in international climate finance, and we can see that there is a majority of the funding being given as loans, while grants are a smaller portion. As a disclaimer, the OECD reporting has been criticized by civil society organizations and by developing countries for overstating the actual contributions of developed countries. And with the last slide, I want to put the 100 billion goal into perspective. So this figure of 100 billion US dollars is quite arbitrary. It's not based on the analysis of countries' actual needs. So even if we were to meet the target after 2022, developing countries still face a huge investment gap. And the total climate investments, as shown in this graph, in developing countries, they need to be increased by a factor of up to 10 annually. So to sum up, the major bottlenecks are currently that the financing flows do not come close to the financing needs. Adaptation finance is particularly low, and private finance mobilized falls far short of predictions. And this brings me to my final point, and you can stop sharing the slides. Thank you. In late 2024, the international community is bound to set a new target for international climate finance. And this is the so-called new collective quantified goal. It should be in excess of 100 billion US dollars and reflect in particular the needs and priorities of developing countries. And we as Decarb think that it's essential, and it's a very good moment to discuss how we can overcome the various sticking points of the current system, and how to improve the delivery and the mobilization of climate finance, and define a meaningful and a realistic goal for a low carbon future. So that was a long introduction. I hope we're all on the same page now. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Tara Shirvani. She works as a senior advisor for sustainability and ESG in the investment management and private equity industry, following a decade of service in multilateral development banks. She holds a PhD in renewable energy and biofuels from the University of Oxford. And Tara has published a best-selling book on how engineering biology can lead to groundbreaking innovations in climate action. With her strong educational and professional background, Tara is known for her expertise in developing high-profile climate projects and policies at the nexus of disruptive technologies, sustainability, and climate finance. So Tara, we're looking forward to your perspective on the topic. So the next roughly 10 minutes are yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Florian. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today and share some of my thoughts with you. I really feel like I kind of did a kind of a tour around the world, so to speak. I started off very much from, working at the World Bank in this IFI world and having much more of a public investment perspective and a blended finance investment perspective. And today I find myself advising much more private markets and private equity groups on how to consider impact investing and what it means for EM markets. And it's very interesting always to see and compare the different views on it. But as Florian as well said, I mean, when we're looking at the capital, we really see that there, especially in private infrastructure, the investment in low and middle income countries has declined dramatically over the last 10 years. I mean, the volumes that we saw in 2021 were less than half of those in 2012, and less than a third of that was in the energy sector. So while actually global investments in the low carbon transition began to rapidly accelerate 2021, going up from 1.2 trillion to 1.7 trillion, most of that growth we have seen in low carbon transition actually has been in more developed markets such as the US, Europe, and China. And EM regions have seen very little growth. Some have even seen declines that we see. So I think the question of why this has happened and why private markets are still staying shy of really committing to unlocking and leveraging finance together with MDBs is one that's very interesting. From the perspective I hear always, firstly, I think when we look at EM countries, they're still, from a private market perspective, still perceived as riskier on issues of governance, rule of law, and streamlined business processes. Now, whether that is justified or not, it does inflate the risk premiums and reduces the pool of available capital in the end. Foreign exchange risk can also be a deterrent. For example, if you look at lurking currencies, that they weaken and then the revenues from local projects lose the value in terms of their currencies. And hedging against those currency risks can actually be really quite expensive. On top of that, as Florian was saying, many of these EM regions are also inherently vulnerable to climate risk given their geography, and typically also lack the physical infrastructure. So that also kind of comes into a feedback loop, because then there's a lack of insurance for such investment projects against physical damage that makes investments from the private markets much more riskier and costlier to finance. But I think as we were saying, the investment needs are just enormous across EM, and we're really not close to even meet substantial amount of that. In fact, actually, the annual investment shortfall that we have is about 17 to 24 times higher than what is estimated even in the public commitments to climate finance as part of the larger UN discussions that are reported. So while we have kind of reached a $1 billion target, albeit 2 years late, this investment, as exactly Florian was saying, is mostly kind of concentrated in decarbonisation rather than climate adaptation and resilience. And public funding has been really quite ineffective in mobilizing private capital at scale. And this is, I think, where multilateral development banks can play a very important role, together with private sector and private financiers, so to speak. But I think there is the big question is, well, what are the thoughts around how we can close this financing gap for emerging markets, and what kind of reforms it would really take? On the one side, I think the thing that, is very important, that it's still the same kind of discussion we've had probably 10, 15 years ago, is closing financing gaps through public reforms. We still see public reforms as having really kind of two key types of impacts and investment implications for private markets. One is their effect on the overall speed and shape of the transition and the related physical climate change, and the associated investment opportunities, of course, in EM. I think that the current drive for reform is likely to mean that many EM countries are, able to maybe decarbonize even faster. And on the other side, with these reforms, public financial institutions are much more able to facilitate private climate investments in EM, to really unlock new investments in tangible assets and hard-to-abate sectors such as transport, infrastructure, industry, and even climate resilience. So I think pushing for more public reforms on the one side will increase project transparency, supporting larger initiatives, yet also investors who are willing to assume these kinds of risks are also able to meet the liquidity requirements and find the right attractive opportunities. But I think it's also important not to kind of push also the viewpoint on only the countries and the reform that is needed. I think also private investors themselves and asset managers play a critical role in thinking about what they can do better in financing this gap, so to speak. And there's some of the thoughts that, I want to share, and I'm happy to kind of, as part of the QA, kind of go a little bit more into it. One is, of course, having better tools to address the current financing crisis, so to speak. So the thing that comes very much to mind is risk mitigation instruments, more deployment of guarantees, insurance products, first loss protections that can make investments in EM more attractive by reducing this perceived risk, so to speak. We also see that many of the blended finance models, which combine public and private funds, can actually reduce this first stop loss risk for private investors and help them absorb the initial losses that would come possibly through these new types of financing models, really allowing the unlocking of more private capital. Something that I think has been working quite well is, I think, more innovative financing tools such as green bonds, transition finance bonds, resilience bonds, everything that kind of falls into the sustainability linked loans industry, so to speak, as an example of instruments that can also provide the necessary capital for climate projects, while also offering the returns that are aligned with the expectation that private investors as well have. It's interesting, I think, when you are on the private side, that the perspectives on the horizons and investment horizons are also very different than what you can see when you are on the MDB side. So climate investments really have a very long gestation period, so to speak. And having a long-term investment perspective is really quite crucial to see those through, particularly in sectors such as infrastructure, renewable energy. And it takes quite a long time where returns are realized. And I think there has to be a shift in mindset from private investors to be aligned with this new investment perspective, so to speak. And then I think the third one of the last ones, is really this enhanced transparency and governance. So how can we improve transparency and governance standards in these emerging markets to attracting more private capital? There's everything that is kind of coming into capacity development that the IFIs are doing really well, and international bodies can help to improve the overall investment climate. There's also, I think, strategic responses that we should think about more closer, in addition to really enhancing the private sector involvement. One of it is really, as I was saying, the policy and regulatory framework. So how can we have advanced economies focus on building sustainable policy regulatory frameworks that really help to attract more private investment on a long-term basis? This may mean maybe more opportunities also for increased risk sharing. So MDBs can, now they're going much more into, I think, this process of rethinking risk sharing and with private investors, new forms of capital, whether that is hybrid capital, guarantees, where it is, especially in the nature-based solution industry, we now see much more nature debt swaps opportunities, new types of tools and financing that is much more fit for purpose, I think is the right way to go if we really want to dramatically scale up the financing that is needed in the short amount of time that we have. And then at the same time, as I was saying with these examples of the nature debt swaps, it's all about also kind of considering the fiscal space that some of these countries have where you want to invest into climate finance and debt relief. So how can we provide debt relief for low-income countries is really kind of critical to creating fiscal space for climate investments and really breaking the cycle of worsening debt and climate crisis. And I think I hope that this is also where the direction of where the direction of the loss and damage fund is going. All in all, I think I'm just going to stop here. But there's just one last, I would say there's just one last number that I want to like kind of keep in mind with you with, and we haven't gotten into it. But the point is to say, none of these investors can do it by themselves, whether that is the MDBs, the private sector, or the public financing. If you only would, for example, consider MDBs and just taking all the balance sheets of all the MDBs together to fully devoted to decarbonisation and climate resilience, they would still only comprise 4% of the financing need that is necessary to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So we cannot do it all by ourselves. We have to work together. And the more innovative products and tools we can think of, I think, is the right way forward in order to find a better path. And I'll stop here and happy to go into questions later.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was very interesting. So you said that for private investors, they always find it hard to invest in developing markets because of the high perceived risk or the high risks, and also the investment horizons that they always find less attractive. One question to follow up, a brief question to you. You seem to be quite optimistic about blended finance. Do you think there's enough platforms where private and public financial institutions meet, where they discuss how to share risk and how to develop new financial instruments, or is there a lack of such, and should that be further enhanced?
Very good question. I'm not sure if it's the lack of the platforms that is the real issue. I think the issue is, I think, this having this different or adjusted mindset in what does it mean to invest in these new types of climate projects, so to speak, right? I mean, if you come with your traditional view of bankable projects, and this is what you anticipate that you are going to get your, 12% return on investment in X amount of time, even if you come to the blended finance table, if you have still the same expectations, I don't think you will get much out of it. So I think it's much more about having both parties at the table, having a different appreciation of, basically, this is not a project by project, country by country risk considerations, which sometimes the MDBs do very much. But this is all very systemic issues that we're facing, and we need much more systemic solutions and tools that really would address the financing. And that would mean that, of course, also private sector has to have a different vision of returns, a different risk appetite. And at the same time, the MDBs also have to have a different kind of willingness to mobilize new, more effective, faster investment tools, so to speak.
Thank you. Very interesting. So with that, I'd like to move to our second speaker, who is Alexander Vasa. He is a senior specialist in capital markets and financial institutions at the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. He has supported national development banks across the Latin American and Caribbean region in the design and implementation of green credit lines, de-risking instruments, and green bond strategies, and has frequently cooperated with multilateral and bilateral climate funds. Before joining the IDB, Alex worked for the European Union and researched the effectiveness of climate projects. He holds a PhD in law and economics from University Erasmus Rotterdam. Today, he will speak about his work at an MDB, and we are very excited to hear from you. The floor is yours, Alex.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Tara. I think Tara, coming to speak after Tara is really a pleasure, because she already introduced all of the main topics that I will speak about in some certain detail and give some examples of how we at the IDB already working in this space and to some extent even shaping this space. So very happy to talk about that. So what is the potential role of MDBs in mobilizing finance for climate resilience and mitigation and development? I will start off where Tara left off, basically. So there are three main lines that we work in on the public sector side in capital markets and financial institutions. We work with public development banks to green their lending portfolio. Public development banks are somewhat a curiosity in Latin America. There are about 100 national and subnational public development banks in Latin America. The biggest are possibly known to most of the audience. For instance, BNDES in Brazil. BNDES is from the balance sheet even bigger than the IDB itself. But there are 99 others that are specialized in infrastructure and agriculture, in housing, and they have a public sector mandate. So we work with them to help them fulfill that mandate in light of the national determined contributions of their countries. And I'll speak a little bit to that on how we do that on a transaction basis and how we are now moving to a holistic basis to move these institutions towards a Paris alignment. Furthermore, the second point, we develop capital market solutions. Green bonds and thematic bonds is what Tara already mentioned. But in this space, we also developed debt to nature solutions, some of which were the biggest recently issued, the one in Ecuador, for instance. And we leverage strategic partnerships on knowledge and also building coalitions to make these partnerships without which these solutions wouldn't work. Donors come to mind on one side. We work with the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, as well as bilateral funds such as the German International Climate Initiative, the Danish Energy Agency, UK Aid, but also with investors directly. So we create solutions taking account of different perspectives and trying to solve the issue based on the barriers that we understand from these discussions. So going into the public development bank space, who are our clients there? So they are on one side the public development banks, on the other they are the financial supervisors with whom we are creating an ecosystem that is able to channel capital towards green projects. So what are the goals within which we work? So as I'll show in a bit, one of the challenges is to address financial and non-financial barriers. And these financial barriers could be exchange rate issues, the concessionality of capital for new types of projects that banks and those who implement the projects do not know. So there are kind of unknown risks, project and market risks. The operating costs of such projects. And then there are non-financial barriers. So the lack of track record in this space. So the lack of pipeline, the bankability of projects itself is a mix because it's a knowledge as well as a financial issue. So what we are doing very often is we are helping these public development banks to gain access to climate finance to address these issues. And this climate finance can be used for technical assistance as well as for blending it with ordinary capital of the IDB and creating either loan solutions, guarantee solutions, or others, which I will mention. So we provide institutional capacity for these public development banks to create projects as well as strategies. We originate and green IDB operations. What that means is then when we see an opportunity to work with a public development bank, we see what can be done to increase the impact in terms of mitigation and adaptation for IDB operations. And we produce lessons learned and share this knowledge as widely as we can so that other public development banks in our region can learn from that, but also other public development banks and multilateral development banks can learn from this process. There are 500 public development banks worldwide. So what does that mean in practice? So in terms of operations, we develop global credit lines with and without concessional capital as needed, tailored to the needs. We provide de-risking solutions such as guarantee funds, for instance, for SMEs, but also for larger scale infrastructure. And we help public development banks create sustainability-linked and performance-based operations. I give a couple of examples. What does that mean for the technical assistance? So we start with a green and climate self-assessment of the bank. Where does it sit? We help them with portfolio tagging on environmental and social and climate and biodiversity related risk management. This is important from a risk perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective to see when the banks do a project, they need to fulfill certain criteria to do the project with by mitigating actually harm to the environment and to the social groups that might be affected. A common example there is hydropower plants. They are green by design, but they have had in the past large impacts towards the community, and these environmental and social safeguards mechanisms attend to these risks and aim to avoid those risks. Monitoring, verification, and reporting. This has become very important from an MDB standpoint, but more and more, actually, the governors of the public development banks are interested to understand what are the impacts that the public development banks achieve. So we are helping the banks set up these systems and create the metrics internally. And this is the basis for sustainable finance strategies, which means that the public development bank itself can create strategies to say, okay, now I'm financing X% of my portfolio in green, and I want to increase that or double that or increase that by 20% by date X. And we are helping them to create these sustainable finance strategies and to have the credibility to do that and the comfort to set up these strategies and milestones. And the technical assistance supports in designing concrete loan and guarantee operations. On top of that, we have dialogues in several countries, mesas de sustentabilidad in Spanish, or financial innovation labs, like the one in Brazil, where we bring in public and private sector actors to discuss on several topics and to find solutions. Some of these solutions include changes in regulations like tax reduction for green debentures in Brazil, and other solutions that have been developed in the past years. On knowledge, I will not go into detail, but what we have is a website, Green Finance Luck, where you can find, and our clients can find, all the information. And we provide, as mentioned, access to donors. I will not go into detail into this slide, but it shows basically the flow. We usually work with a partner for grants or concessional finance. The partner can also provide knowledge, and we structure an operation at the IDB with the public development banks that then can work through either directly financing projects, small and large scale, or work through private banks. This is the LFI part on the right side. And that's how the national development banks or public development banks, they achieve a multiplier effect. And these public development banks can also issue green bonds or thematic bonds. And I will come back to that. We can also share the slide afterwards. What I'm showing you here is a new facility that we are building, where we are incentivizing the establishment of green strategies with the components that we mentioned before, and it has a sustainability linked component in which we set up milestones with the public development banks. And we have a budget to, once these milestones are realized, that we pay lump sum payments to the public development banks. This is a short overview about some of the institutions we work with. In Latin America, we are covering almost the whole of the 26 countries in which Latin America is working. And those parts that are missing is one Bolivia, where we are working now already with one of the public development banks. They're very interested in both sustainability-linked solutions as well as capital market solutions. Here are a couple of examples that some of which we work with funding from the Green Climate Fund. All the information is publicly available, but we are also happy to provide more information for those who want to look into more detail. So the first is on energy efficiency and biomass. The second bullet is on bioeconomy credit lines that we've developed with the Green Climate Fund. It's project FP173. We're happy to provide more information on this. The third is this facility that I spoke about, which is just now in the approval process. And we have a green coalition of 17 public development banks to work together with them on the Amazon. And one topic that is quite new and quite hot is the exchange rate hedging platform that we're developing for Brazil's green transformation plan. There's a press release out. There's a lot of support for this from several actors high up in the treasury and interest, because as Avinash Prasad just published a paper on that, most of the cost of capital costs can actually not be costed the way they are from the exchange rate costs, which is an overpayment of these costs. It's an interesting paper. Happy to share this for those who haven't seen it. So what do we do on capital markets? Very similarly, only that there we open the spectrum to other clients, sovereigns, state-owned enterprises, capital markets and pension fund regulators. And there we want to develop the markets and increase its sophistication in terms of issuers and issuances. I will skip this slide. I will only mention that we are working on several issues that I will go into detail. We are working on a roadmap for Amazonia bonds. We have a platform where we follow the impact, and we work with the EU and KfW on several partnerships and initiatives. The next slide is actually going into more detail what we're doing with the clients, which I think is more interesting, is that we start with institutional strengthening from the ESG rating, the environmental and social system for the issuers that we work with, a GHG framework, and in general, sustainable finance capacity building. And then we start off to build a framework. A green bond is very similar to a plain vanilla bond. It just promises to the investors that you will, as an issuer, you will invest in specific eligible activities. And so what you need for that is a framework and identify an eligible portfolio. So you cannot do only one of these two, because later when you need to report a year after issuance, you will not have potentially sufficient portfolio. So that will be a credibility issue for you, a reputational issue. So the second point is to evaluate the institutional ESG profile and the strategy. If the issuer is issuing use of proceed bonds, that's quite important, but it's even more important when you issue a sustainability-linked bond, because in a sustainability-linked bond, you do not know exactly where the money flows. So the credibility of the issuer to fulfill its promises is very important. So we are preparing the framework, and we accompany the second-party opinion provision by a third-party opinion provider. We are usually financing the framework as well as the second-party opinion or the CBI Climate Bonds Initiative certification. We're helping in some cases on the financial structuring for public and private placements. And where required, we provide a credit enhancement feature, a guarantee, or an anchor investments through our partners, be it our private sector partner, IDB Invest, the Latin American Green Bond Fund by KfW, or now new solutions with the EU Global Green Bond Initiative. For the roadshow, we provide market research and support the roadshow activities. And in the reporting, we set pre-issuance indicators and systems. And we have a free platform, which is called Green Bond Transparency platform on greenbondtransparency.com, which is freely accessible. All the data is downloadable for free without login. And all the data there is by issuers themselves. And in post-issuance, we provide learning materials and toolkits. We develop taxonomies, help countries develop taxonomies in this space too. The Green Bond Transparency Platform is an initiative that we have developed and that we are now globalizing. As mentioned, it's a free tool. It helps issuers to report in a more transparent way. Tara mentioned the importance of transparency. And while there are many governance structures, one way that we have addressed this issue in the green bond space is to provide a platform where issuers can provide data and information in a standardized format, and everybody can use it, and it's accessible for investors, civil society, academics. And we have used it for several, for instance, for a call for papers whose link is shared in the slides. It also facilitates investors to make their decisions on bonds, not on the bonds that they have bought already, but on bonds that come after those, or hold decisions on bonds that they have bought, and they see how they perform environmentally and socially, but also on the next bonds that are coming. This is a screenshot. For more information, feel free to go to the website and get in touch with us. We have been lucky to win an award for this, and to globalize it build a concept to globalize it with other multilateral development banks. This is an overview about how many thematic bonds we have supported in Latin America with the frameworks that we have co-developed with our clients. This brings the tally to 42 billion. This is only the IDB public sector part. The IDB Invest part, our sister organization for the private sector, adds almost the same amount in terms of bonds, not the volume, but a number would increase almost twofold. The reason, as you see, most of the impact comes from Chile in terms of numbers, because they have developed a whole program from the sovereign side. Brazil and Colombia and Uruguay are also noteworthy public sector issues, sovereign issues that we have supported, with Uruguay issuing the first SLB with a step down, very interesting structure. Happy to talk more about that. So here are the examples of the bonds that we have issued. I think the
sorry, Alex, you've already exceeded your time. It would be great if you could come to an end soon. Thanks.
Thank you for helping me with this, Florian. I thought that could happen. So I think that I'm wrapping up. One issue here is just to say that we have a new finance innovation hub with 8 other organizations, the latest link here, in which we discuss how we can increase the impact on guarantees for our clients. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex. I think that provided a really good overview on the activities of a MDB, especially for the people in the audience that are not very familiar with that. I would directly jump to Andrew for our next talk. So Andrew is a finance professional and a CFA charter holder with over 7 years of professional experience in development-focused investment research. And in his current role at Convergence, which is a global network for blended finance, he's developing blended finance trends analysis and benchmarks. Andrew worked in the financial industry before, and he holds a master's degree in sociology from the University of Cambridge. At Convergence, Andrew was involved in elaborating the State of Blended Finance report for 2023, with a focus on climate finance, and he will now present the report's main findings to us before we then go into the plenary discussion. And to the audience, please feel free to start posting questions in the Q&A box. Over to you, Andrew.
Many thanks for that introduction, Florian. I'm just sharing my screen, so bear with me. Just confirming that everybody's able to see my screen.
Yes, now we see the right screen.
Okay, sorry. Bear with me. There we go, share that. Okay, so Convergence is, obviously the global network for blended finance. We generate blended finance intelligence and deal flow to increase private sector investment in developing countries. In this presentation, I'm going to be going over some of the key trends from our State of Blended Finance 2023 report, which we published in October. So blended finance, of course, is the use of catalytic capital from public or philanthropic sources to increase private sector investment in developing countries to realize the SDGs. Convergence curates the largest database of historical blended finance transactions that's available globally. To be included in our database, a deal must have at least one private sector investor, have a concessional below market component, and support the SDGs in developing countries. Our database comprises over 1,000 transactions, 485 of which are climate focused. Aggregate transaction value totals around $198 billion, with climate blended finance deals accounting for around 55% or $109 billion of the total market size. As we can see, from the data on the slide, over the last decade, the blended finance market has comprised around 77 deals per year on average, with 41 deals per year targeting climate outcomes. Despite capturing a similar deal count in 2022 compared to 2021, Convergence found that total deal volume decreased by approximately 45% in 2022 and about 55% in climate blended finance, which was actually a 10-year low in total financing. Climate blended transactions also accounted for under 40% of all blended deals in 2022, while in each of the previous 5 years, climate-focused transactions accounted for around 50% or more of the annual deal count. With most private financing originating from investors in the global north, these trends reflect larger macro challenges which impacted financing flows into emerging markets in 2022. So, for example, inflationary pressures and rising interest rates in the global north, the continued fallout from COVID-19 in emerging markets and mounting emerging market debt burdens, and also geopolitical instabilities. However, these trends also reflect fundamental challenges in scaling blended finance overall, and in climate blended finance in particular, as we'll explore later in this presentation. So to achieve a net zero scenario, it's critical that private sector financing grows both in relative and absolute terms compared to public sources. However, in terms of financing volumes for climate blended finance, public sector investors have so far outpaced private sector investors in recent years, providing an annual average of around $2.3 billion more than the private sector since 2017. The Climate Policy Initiative has also found that the growth rate of public climate finance is outpacing the private sector, despite the IEA estimating that by 2030, private financing should account for around 65% or 2/3 of the overall financing needed in clean energy to achieve a net zero scenario. Indeed, while there are indications that developed countries have met their target to mobilize $100 billion to help developing countries with climate change in 2022, the most recent published OECD data shows that mobilized private climate finance has actually been stagnating since 2017, despite the consistent growth in public climate finance since 2015. Adaptation blended finance continues to be underrepresented, with only around 15% of deals since 2013 having a pure adaptation focus. This equates to $7.5 billion in total financing, compared to $64.2 billion for pure mitigation and $18.5 billion for hybrid transactions. All the invested classes that we track have been primarily focused on mitigation blended finance transactions in recent years, as the chart shows. Finally, hybrid transactions, which address both climate mitigation and adaptation goals, represent an area of opportunity for the private sector to invest using an adaptation lens. So our data shows that around 45% of institutional investments into climate finance are within hybrid solutions. So when we talk about institutional investments, this is obviously from pension funds, insurance companies, and so on. So 45% of their investments in climate finance are within hybrid solutions, compared to around 35% within mitigation and 20% in adaptation. However, as we can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the participation of these institutional investors in climate blended transactions is still limited compared to other commercial investors, as the chart shows. So now I'll talk about some of the key challenges for climate blended finance that we've identified, not just in the State of Blended Finance 2023, but also in the report of the prior year, 2022, where we presented different challenges preventing the market for climate blended finance from scaling. Of all of the challenges that we kind of presented, I'll focus on two of them in this presentation. So first, the lack of strategic coordination and unguided implementation of capital mobilization for climate. So the status quo, of course, has shown a consistent inability to mobilize the private sector effectively. High levels of perceived risk in developing regions are a constant barrier to private sector investment, as has already been raised in this webinar this morning. The sovereign risk ratings of most developing countries are beyond the mandate and criteria of many investors, with a median risk rating of B or below, such that the private capital will not flow to SDG or climate projects in developing markets without sufficient public sector support to mitigate these risks. Unfortunately, so far, the public and private sectors remain largely disconnected and uncoordinated in their operation, sometimes crowding out each other's investments rather than reinforcing comparative advantages, with a lack of investable transactions also continuing to be an added constraint. This mirrors a broader challenge in scaling blended finance overall. So Convergence as an organization has written a lot about the general challenges that blended finance as a structuring approach faces. And the key one that we identified in our report in 2021 is that while donors are the main source of the catalytic funding that mobilizes private investment, they have not really prioritized and budgeted private sector mobilization as a necessity to significantly narrowing the SDG financing gap, with only around 2 to 3% of official development assistance allocated annually to private sector mobilization, and few MDBs and DFIs really possessing meaningful private sector mobilization activities and targets. The second challenge that I'll talk about on this slide relates to low levels of education and expertise in climate finance, which in turn contributes to low levels of private investment towards climate goals. So in our State of Blended Finance report in 2022, we discussed the disparity between investor rhetoric, as shown by the multitude of ESG strategies and net zero commitments that have been announced over the past few years, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the commitments that we observe to climate blended finance. So this disparity can partly be attributed to a lack of investors adequately pricing negative externalities and climate risks within their investment decision-making, making it appear more profitable to invest in fossil fuels, which reflects a greater market failure. Market stakeholders have noted that the market isn't integrating the right analytics on the right time horizon for investors into asset prices. So that is how physical risks and climate change really impact factors like cash flow models, revenue projections, capital expenditure, discount rates, and ultimately net present value, and not just loss and damage. So really the problem here is that having added the additional required capital expenditure, for example, to their valuation models after integrating physical climate risks, the changes in net present value that result don't properly compensate investors, which in turn disincentivizes this course of action for investors. Also, when it comes to market forces like regulation and credit quality and standards, these also haven't fully integrated physical climate risks either, which often leads to inefficient enforcement and inefficient rewarding of good integration practices. So on this slide, I'll talk about some of the recommendations that we've been making in recent years in terms of how blended finance, climate blended finance can start to address some of the challenges that we've identified, and how we can try and move towards scale. So of all of the recommendations that we've presented, I'll focus on two of them in this morning's presentation. So first of all, again, going back to the theme of MDBs and DFIs and their activity that we've already kind of touched upon in this webinar, we've argued that MDBs and DFIs should start to, or should better integrate climate and private sector mobilization KPIs into their operating models. So in our data, we've shown that MDBs and DFIs are the most active investor set within blended finance, and so have a critical role to play in terms of scaling blended finance for climate. Convergence has argued that MDBs and DFIs, donor shareholders, should establish a set of KPIs prioritizing private sector mobilization. So under this model, MDBs and DFIs would use their capital for several purposes. For example, they would originate more in-demand financial assets in developing countries, which would then be distributed to blended vehicles and investors. They would also invest in mezzanine positions in blended vehicles, which would help to create investment assets that meet the fiduciary obligations of private investors. And they would also originate financial assets that are in low demand by investors, but which have high financial and development additionality. And then hold these assets on their balance sheets when they can't be distributed to blended vehicles and investors. Like overall on this point, the argument that Convergence has been making is that a more intensive de-risking strategy by donor governments and philanthropic foundations to create investable assets that the private sector can invest in, backed by a strategic increase in the supply of catalytic funding, would help to unlock private capital at scale. The second recommendation that we've got here relates to some of the difficulties that we've touched upon in terms of scaling adaptation finance in particular. So one of the points that we made in the State of Blended Finance 2023 is that the development community should be working towards establishing common taxonomies for key themes in climate, such as adaptation finance. Adaptation finance, of course, remains underrepresented in the blended finance market in line with overarching market findings. The investment barriers facing adaptation have been well documented. One key issue kind of underlying many of these barriers is the lack of a clear taxonomy stating the parameters of what climate adaptation constitutes. So at the moment, adaptation and physical risk disclosures have not been widely integrated within robust regulatory bodies like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that is, adaptation finance really lacks a comprehensive reference guide or a set of common rules and guidelines like there is with the green bond principles or the social bond principles. Obviously, investors, private sector investors, prefer things that can be structured in a way that they can understand and that's acceptable to them and their end investors. So with these risks being undervalued within investment opportunities, adaptation risks continuing to be seen as a cost additive, as organizations that we spoke to in the adaptation field have kind of affirmed. The expansion of the adaptation taxonomy can direct investors to adaptation solutions which are currently beyond their radar. So for example, companies helping to manage droughts and disease and supply chain disruptions and other climate impacts are often not referred to or recognized as climate related. So expanding the taxonomy can not only address some of the risks and gaps associated with deal structuring, but will also help to increase the pool of climate-related solutions and bankable projects. So ultimately, what we've argued in our most recent report is that if the broader climate finance community can begin to effectively outline a taxonomy for adaptation, concessional players could pay for adaptation benefits and that otherwise couldn't be monetized. MDBs could also begin to disclose and generate more data to support measuring benefits that can help to scale blended finance for climate. I think I'm at time, so I'll stop here and thanks everybody for the time.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was very concise, very helpful. Just as a short follow-up question to you, is it possible to name one specific instrument or mechanism that is used particularly for blended finance in the climate field? Can you give an example for our audience?
In terms of a particular instrument or mechanism?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good point. So in terms of the data that we see in blended finance for climate, reflecting the overall market, it would be archetypes like concessional debt and equity in the capital stack, which we see most prominently. So in terms of the archetypes that Convergence tracks in our data set, we have 4 different main archetypes: concessional debt and equity, as I mentioned, guarantees, technical assistance, and then also design funding. So in terms of the transactions that we cover, in our reports, we obviously present lots of examples of different vehicles. So for example, Climate Investor One is a structure that we've actually written a case study on, which combines I think elements of concessional a concessional layer of debt and equity in their capital stack in order to help mobilize investors into the vehicle. But yeah, there's a wide variety of course of different examples of vehicles and structures. But in terms of the bulk of the climate transactions that we track, mirroring the overall market, I think the number is around 60 to 70% of all of the transactions that we cover or that we track in our data set will have some kind of concessional debt and equity layer in their balance sheet.
Okay, thank you. So now we heard the 3 presentations from our speakers. I think we have many ideas that can be discussed now. So I'd like to bring back all the speakers on stage now. If you could open your cameras again. We have first questions in the Q&A as well, in the Q&A box. However, I'd like to start with one question to Alex. So Andrew, he suggested 2 things that I think are very interesting. The first one is integrating some blended finance KPIs in the operating models of MDBs, and the second is establishing more taxonomies, particularly for adaptation finance. For you as someone working in a development bank, do you think that's realistic, or what are the sticking points? Could that be implemented in the next years, and would that help close the gap?
Yeah, I'll start with the adaptation taxonomy, and then I'll speak a little bit about the indicators that we use at the IDB. On the adaptation taxonomy, we have been working on the capital market side with the Climate Bonds Initiative for an adaptation taxonomy. Beyond that, we have the MDB Joint Climate Finance methodology. But as such, all the taxonomies, like local as well as regional taxonomies in Latin America, have an adaptation component. So it would be interesting to understand a little bit better where the gap is. I think that what the taxonomy can help, and I think that's where Andrew's point is very relevant, is to give clarity to all, not only the public but also the private sector, about what can count as adaptation. And there's still a challenge to actually define that. It's much easier for mitigation, and we have tried to be part of the contribute to this standardizing effort since a couple of years with CBI. And then the next step is actually to implement that, to find projects that fit this criteria and actually implement that. On the blended finance criteria, we have an indicator on mobilized climate finance, and when we work with our donors, they also want to distinguish between catalyzed climate finance and directly mobilized climate finance. At this moment, I do not think that we would go beyond that. The reason is that while a lot what we do is to mobilize climate finance, there's at the broader aspect of the bank, not everything is linked to the private sector. Not everything in climate is linked to the private sector. So unless I'm not well informed, at the IDB corporate level, the introduction of these of specific blended finance criteria indicators is more challenging. However, when we work on projects with the ones that we spoke about, we take account of blended finance criteria. We try to use minimum concessionality, and we work within that space. It's not always that we report officially through the IDB climate through the corporate reporting systems. We would do it on specific project basis within a standard, and that's the criteria that we use, and also because the resources are pretty scarce, so we have an interest to use them in an efficient way.
Thank you. I'd like to come to one question that is in the Q&A box. It's from a guest from India. She's saying there is a possibility of establishing, oh, that's the question. Is there a possibility of establishing a platform tailored to the Global South, which matches project funding requests from governments of Global South nations with climate financing interests of the private sector? The platform would have an account of the climate risk vulnerability index of countries, sector-wise climate finance requirements, and also list funding interests for private organizations. So instead of bilaterally engaging with countries through MDBs or international organizations, there would be a standardized platform where recipients of finance and financiers interact, leading to a higher transparency of climate finance flows and increasing accountability of the private sector's role in climate finance. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, perhaps I can speak first, and obviously great to hear from the other panelists too. So it's a very interesting question, because one of the key themes that we kind of explored in the report we published in October is some of the difficulties, I guess, with the just energy transition partnerships and how they've currently been structured. So, of course, those are, financing mechanisms helping codependent economies kind of move towards, renewable energy sources while also supporting marginalized communities. And one of the recommendations that we were having is trying to think through how developing countries can be, I guess, more in the driving seat in terms of how they're structured. So at the moment, part of the difficulties that they faced is that because of the multiplicity of donors that are kind of involved in a single JETP structure, sometimes the provisioning of financing from donors can be a bit incoherent and difficult for developing countries to manage. So on that question of whether some kind of a fund or some kind of a structure can be created in which developing nations are in the forefront in terms of liaising with the private sector, creating their own investment plans relevant to their own domestic energy needs, really creating investment plans specific to their needs and their requirements. It's something that we've, in that report, we kind of presented that as a recommendation for the JETP model. Because at the moment, what happens with JETPs is, you have a big announcement of a particular funding amount, and then after that, it's then a matter for the particular developing country at hand to try and work out how that to work out how that funding can then be dispersed. So what we've proposed in the report, and it would be great to hear anybody's reaction to it, is really doing it in the opposite way. So working with the domestic private sector and other kind of key stakeholders to create investment plans relevant to the domestic energy mix from the ground up, and then marketing that to potential donors and other kind of partners around the world. So I guess that's an immediate response to that great question.
Thanks. Any other reactions to that idea?
Yeah, I would also have a reaction. It also connects a little bit with Egor's question on the transaction costs of financing climate projects, at least where I sit, and I haven't mentioned this explicitly in the public sector part. And we can split the two questions, but most of the financing that comes from the IDB, well, all of the financing that comes from the IDB public sector comes with a sovereign guarantee, which means that the government itself needs to say that they want that in the budget space that Tara had mentioned at the very beginning. If this is the case, then the country can receive funding at very preferential rates that the country themselves would not be able to access on the capital markets. And this is because of the AAA guarantee of the IDB, which we have because we are cooperative, and there are 48 countries. In our case, the World Bank has a different structure involved. That guarantee basically the capital of the bank. And that means that the IDB issues a bond as if it were a developed country. It has a AAA rating, receives very cheap funds. And these funds then get channeled to our member countries from Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay. All of them all get the same interest rate. They all get the same preferential rate. And this process takes time. It has its transaction costs and so on. But more than not, it is a prioritization process. And after that, this money can be channeled either to public development banks or through the Ministry of Energy or through the Ministry of Building and Works into climate projects. And it could be passed on this preferential rate. And that's where a platform would make sense. Without that, a platform could be just private to private. There are the needs of the project developers and the investors. The issue there becomes the actual rate that the investors require from this investment. And this is also something that Tara mentioned at the beginning. If you have an expectation of 12 or X%, then you need to ensure as the project developer, the local project developer, that you are providing this this rate. And if there is a risk that you don't provide this rate, then the investor might jump off, right? So there might be also adjustment needed, as Tara mentioned, on the investor side. But what you do usually is you buffer these risks through blended finance or through a concessional loan or a combination thereof. And so this is why some of these topics take a little bit a longer time. I'm happy to go into more detail on Egor's question, but maybe I'll stop there for the first question.
Thank you. Yes, so there's also another question, maybe that's for Tara. Someone is asking if there is a lack of climate finance or a lack of bankable projects. If both, what are the needed steps to the greening of the economy?
Yeah, I think it's a it's a very interesting question, because I think on the one side, for sure, there's a lack of climate finance. I mean, we discussed that and we've seen the numbers, and I think that those speak for itself. Particularly when it comes to resilience and adaptation, we just don't have enough climate finance, even for decarbonisation for emerging markets. And the lack of bankable finance project, I think, again, it depends on the definition of what is a bankable project, right? And the definitions vary quite a bit, I think, depending on the perspective of the investor that you have and the returns that you're looking for. So I think that public-private financing, public-private partnerships, more innovative models which bring in sustainability-linked products, doesn't have to be necessarily bonds, is what we need really kind of in order to have the right tools to tackle this, the systemic issues that we're facing. I mean, there's a lot of thing around now around these nature debt swaps. So really kind of to also kind of tap into the fiscal considerations that come with bringing down the debt burden of many of these emerging markets and linking this to climate. I think those are kind of some more innovative ideas. And we need to kind of think a bit more in terms of, what are the right projects. But definitely, I think the work that Alex is doing and Andrew is definitely very highly going into the right direction here.
So you're saying we need some innovative tools, some new ideas and mechanisms. You mentioned these debt for nature swaps. Could you briefly explain what that is, and has it actually worked well? Because I feel that it's been around for a while, but apparently it's hard to scale it up.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, in a nutshell, it's basically kind of like, you tie a reduction in the sovereign debt of emerging markets with linking it and saying, if you reduce, we will reduce your sovereign debt by X, if this is also tied into committing to doing YZ, climate resilience, or even mitigation type projects in the country. And by doing that, you basically crowd in more private investors as well. And you're basically also tying it in terms of the larger economic considerations that go into play, and like considering investors to also look at things around biodiversity, especially in an emerging market perspective, where risks and what we discussed is still an issue. It is true, I think, that the jury is still out to say if all of those projects are successful. The transaction costs are quite high, I agree. And it's still on a case-by-case basis, I would say, where you really kind of see the examples of they have been really successful. Some of the examples actually in Latin America come to mind there. But I do still think that we have to think about newer, innovative solutions, especially around adaptation, to think how we can bring this financing to countries that at the moment are just constrained given their fiscal capacities and their economic circumstances. And that will mean that maybe we have to go through a kind of a trial and error period and certainly only with the larger use of guarantees and considerations of involvement of the MDBs, this is workable. But with the things of the past, I think the tools of the past, I just don't think we will get there anywhere near.
That's interesting that you're speaking of a trial and error period. So the question about the bankable project, I'd also like to ask Alex, because you presented the work of an MDB and it seemed like things are working quite well, but I'm sure in reality you also have many issues that don't work well. Could you maybe mention from your perspective what are these bottlenecks, or can you actually channel all the funds that you get from your shareholders into climate projects?
So I think that there's a distinction to be made between small scale and large scale projects. Large scale projects to some extent are more complex. They require, let's say, big wind farms or solar panels at a utility scale. They require licenses. They require all sorts of preparation. But in general, they have a certain size where you can set up a team, a local team within the public banks or even the ministry to take account of that. And usually these get channeled pretty quickly into the projects. There may be some issues on exchange rates and these types of risk on how to reduce these risks, but they are not easy, but there is a certain pool of people who know how to do it well. What is much more challenging is to channel funds to smaller scale actors, be it SMEs, agricultural actors, smallholder farmers, and so on. And this is because of their own income business model, whether it's on projects for energy efficiency, small scale renewables, different types of value chains to reduce deforestation. These are new types of practices that both the loan taker, the beneficiary, the smallholder farmers do not know very well, as well as the risks that the banks, they do not understand these risks. So there's a lot of capacity building needed to create the bankable projects, to revise the bankable projects, to set criteria what is actually bankable, and because there's no known track record. So you're entering a space which is kind of new. And that's where risk capital is also very, very relevant. I would make this distinction. On the carbon markets, I mean, that's an interesting one. And that also requires quite some knowledge about the procedures, and in recent years the complexity that is required to do a really good additional carbon offset project has increased, and the scrutiny has increased with it, with certain analysis pointing towards many of these projects having a challenge. So as a large-scale solution, I think it's a more a question mark whether this actually works. We are providing some support for governments in this space, but not directly to the issuance of carbon markets. I would like briefly to go to Egor's question, if that's okay, Florian. I don't know if there's still time, or you wanted to have another follow-up on that question.
So I just saw that Tara must leave this call a bit earlier. If you have to leave now, Tara, thank you very much for your participation. That was very interesting to hear from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for all the lively debate and all the important points. And I look forward to staying in touch and continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara.
Bye.
So since only 3 minutes are left, I think we don't have time to answer the question from the audience. Maybe for the two of you, one final question. Let's assume there is people from the UN sitting in the audience, and they are currently thinking about how to set up a post-2025 agenda for climate finance. What would be the one thing that you tell them, or how to make it better? How can we deliver better on the commitments in the future? If each of you can make one very short comment on that.
Yeah, perhaps I can go first. So I think the main thing that Convergence has been arguing is the importance of boosting the supply of catalytic concessional financing. So that obviously is the source of financing that will help to mobilize the private sector. And the trends that we've been seeing in our data, the trends that we've been tracking and kind of writing on for the past few years, is showing that the supply of concessional financing is not moving in the right direction. It's still limited. It's still a scarce resource. So the main point that Convergence as an organization would make is that a massive increase in the supply of concessional money to help with a focus on mobilizing the private sector, third-party private sector actors is crucially important to helping to achieve, to helping to close the climate financing gap in the years ahead. So I think that's the main message that we'd pass on.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question, Florian. And I think that one point that I would like to make is the availability of local currency financing in climate finance. Most of the climate finance is provided in US dollars. That provides a challenge. Although it's very cheap, it wouldn't be as cheap if it's transformed into other currencies. So the climate finance providers, be it through the UNFCCC mechanisms or others, to provide actually local currency concessional capital, would shift the risks to the funds, but it would make a difference in the on the ground.
Good points. Thank you very much. So I think we have to stop here, unfortunately, but it's been a pleasure to speak to you and with the audience, with the interesting questions from the audience. We tried to squeeze in a lot, and the topic is also huge, so it's very challenging. And there's surely no silver bullet to enhance the international climate field in the future, but I think we covered specific areas that can help enhance the field in the future. So Alex just mentioned that it's important to think about local currency concessional finance, and emphasized the importance of improving the mobilization of private capital in the future. And Tara talked about the shift in the mindset of private investors. Finally, I'd like to thank our partners that are making this entire event series possible. Thank you to the Center for Sustainability at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin for providing the technical infrastructure. We also want to thank the Think Lab of the Stiftung der Deutschen Wirtschaft and E.ON Stiftung, who provided seed funding to kick off decarb. And also a big thank you to our academic partners, the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, the DIW in Berlin, and the Oxford Smith School. I would also like to thank all my colleagues at the Decarb Future Economy Forum and at Hertie School for your work behind the scenes. We are a student-run organization, so we always welcome new volunteers to join us. If you're interested, please contact us, and we would be glad to have you. Finally, maybe my colleague can put on the end slide, I would like to alert you to our next event that is co-organized with the German Development Corporation GIZ, with the title Climate Resilient Development: Can Macroeconomics Face a Climate Crisis? where we will discuss the state of the art of climate economic modeling. This event is planned for late February. Until then, all the best, and I hope to see you again. Thank you for your participation. Bye.